the tabernacle. What is that? Okay. All right. So the Torah tells us that on the first day, the one who gave the korban was Nachshon ben Aminadav, the prince of the Shevet of Yehuda. Nachshon ben Aminadav was a known figure. He was the first one to run into the Yam, into the sea, when the sea split. According to our sages, it was when he ran in that the sea split. The second day, the prince of Shevet Yisachar, Nisanel ben Sur, he gave his korban. He gave the sacrifice at the dedication of the Mishkan. And on the third day, it was Vayom HaShlishi, it was the prince of the tribe of Zvulun that gave the korban. It was Eliyav ben Chelon who gave the sacrifice, and so on and so forth. Now, what's interesting, that the sacrifice that they gave on each day, each one of them gave the exact same sacrifice. They brought a silver bowl, silver basin, a flour, and incense, a young bull, a ram, and so on and so forth. But each one gave the exact same sacrifice. But nevertheless, the Torah tells us, repeats the same sacrifices 12 times. The Torah could have said this was the sacrifice that each of the princes of the tribes of Israel gave, and list what it was, and then say, on the first day, the prince of the tribe of Judah, gave the sacrifice. On the second day, the prince of the tribe of Yisachar gave the sacrifice. On the third day, the prince of the tribe of Zvulun, and so forth, so on and so forth. But instead of doing that, the Torah goes on. The first day, the prince of Judah gave the sacrifice, and this was the sacrifice, and lists all the ingredients of the sacrifice. And then he says, the Torah says, on the second day, the prince of the tribe of Yisachar gave a sacrifice. And then they list all the ingredients again, even though the ingredients were all the same. And then the third day, the prince of the tribe of Zvulun gave a sacrifice, even though it was the same, and every day it was the same sacrifice. Why repeat it 12 times? What was the sacrifice? They make it sound like it was an altogether different sacrifice. And in fact, the ingredients of the sacrifice were exactly the same. Now, I want to go in to the Rambam's explanation of Korbanos. It was one of the most controversial ideas that the Rambam mentioned in Moreh Nevuchim. And the Rambam says that Korbanos sacrifices, he says, is a lower form of worship. On the contrary, he considers prayer a greater form of service to God. But he says that man was of such nature that man had a drive for sacrifices. And if the Torah did not provide for sacrifices because of this drive that man had to give sacrifices. So he might have followed the idolatrous religions, because in idolatry, sacrifices played a major role. And because of that, the Torah, recognizing, perhaps to a certain degree, man's disposition, the drive of man, the Torah provided for sacrifices. But ideally, perhaps, it would seem from the Rambam that had man been at the level where he should have been, there would have been no need for sacrifices. And many from the Ramban, many attacked the Rambam for this suggestion. Now, I know there are those who try to imply that according to the Rambam, the mitzvah of Korbanos, of sacrifices, has no relevancy for the future, because man, at least there is a belief that man has advanced to such a level that they don't have those same drives anymore. I heard from my father, the side note, that my father said, perhaps man doesn't have a drive specifically for sacrifices, but man does have a certain drive for the irrational. People start believing in all kinds of things that don't have, that it cannot be explained on the basis of pure logic. People are scared to walk under a ladder, besides the safety concern. There are people that consider it bad luck on certain days of the week, and something like sacrifices, and that sometimes leads people astray. And a mitzvah like Korbanos, even if one accepts the fact that Korbanos is based on the drive of man, it still has relevance today. The truth is, we don't even need to say that, because a mitzvah is a mitzvah in the Torah. Many of the mitzvahs of the Torah, the Rambam explains, on the basis of the customs of the nations at the time of Avraham Avinu, and negating some of their customs. Once the Torah was given, we submit to the command of God. So the mitzvah of Korbanos, and furthermore, the Rambam devotes a large part of Yad HaChazakah to the mitzvah of Korbanos, the laws of sacrifices. And the Rambam wrote the Yad HaChazakah not to tell us what were the mitzvahs thousands of years ago, but to tell us what the mitzvahs are today and what the mitzvahs will be tomorrow. And the Rambam is very explicit that when Mashiach comes, many of the mitzvahs that temporarily are not active, so to say, will become active again. And he lists Korbanos among them, giving sacrifices among them. So it's clear that the Rambam felt the mitzvah of giving sacrifices, whatever the reason is for it, is a permanent part of the Torah. Now, but many attack the Rambam, and they with this suggestion that the purpose of the Korbanos is because of this backward drive in man, because we see that Adam Arishon, who certainly was not exposed to idolatry, that Noah, that Cain and Hevel, and the Torah speaks positively about Hevel, and even when it talks against Cain, it's for other reasons, because of the nature of the carbon he gave. Cain and Hevel gave sacrifices. Noah gave a sacrifice, regarding which the Torah tells us, Vayarach Hashem es reach hanichoach, that God smelled the sweet smell of the sacrifice of Noah. God accepted his sacrifice. So, and then the Avos, Abraham, when he first comes to Eretz Yisrael, he makes 3 mizbechos, 3 altars. And then ultimately you have the Akedah, where Abraham sacrifices a ram in place of his son Yitzchak. Certainly Avram would not have been driven to idolatry, Chas v'sholom. And this was before the mitzvah of sacrifices was given. And certainly Noah did not have the requirement of sacrifices, or of most of the mitzvahs. How are we to understand the Rambam's reasoning from the perspective of Adam, Hevel, Noah, and the Avos and the patriarchs giving sacrifices? Now, I think that we can make a certain suggestion. I don't know that the Rambam would have agreed with my suggestion, but I think my suggestion could work with what the Rambam mentioned. We know that the question is, why is it that sacrifices is considered a lower form of worship? That an ideal level, perhaps it would be better if there wasn't a mitzvah of sacrifices. And the Navi, when he screams at the Jewish people, he says, Lama li rose es chechem yomar Hashem. God says, I don't need your sacrifices.
Okay, hold on, everyone. Looks like we lost him. Hold on.
Okay, I know.
Lama li rov tzidkechem. The Navi says, why do I need your sacrifices? How does the Navi say that? We have Chumash Vayikra, lots of parts of Bamidbar, and parts of each of the other Chumashim as well that speak about the significance and the importance of Korbanos, of sacrifices. Apparently, Korbanos with the proper intention, if it's expressive of the proper attitude, that it's something that is wanted by God. But if it's not expressive of a proper attitude, then it's something that God says he hates. He doesn't want it. Now, it's very interesting when you take a look. When Noah gave his sacrifice, God said that he wanted the sacrifice of Noah. So Noah is told that Noah is told that Noah is told that now, because up till the time of Noah, man was not allowed to eat meat. It's only after the Mabul, after the flood, that a license was given to man to eat meat. But the license was not given immediately. The license was given only after Noah gave his korban, only after Noah gave his sacrifice. We take a look at the korban of Cain and Hevel, the first Korbanos. Cain was a farmer, and Cain gave from the fruit of the ground as a sacrifice. Our sages say that he gave from the worst of what he grew from the ground to God. Whereas Hevel was a shepherd. Hevel gave from the best of his flock. And the Torah tells us that God turned to Hevel and his korban, and did not turn to Cain, and did not turn to his korban and to his sacrifice. And the question is, what is the idea behind it? What does HaKadosh Baruch Hu need? The best of the flock, the worst of. Is there a difference between the best of the growth and the worst of the growth? But we have to understand there are two possible approaches to understand what was the difference between the sacrifice of Cain and the sacrifice of Hevel. One approach is that Cain, why did he give the worst of the things that grew? Cain saw that he was giving something to God. And therefore, whatever he would give should be considered a generous gesture. Hevel, on the other hand, understood sacrifices not from the perspective so much of giving something to God. Hevel understood that God doesn't need all of this. But for Hevel, the sacrifice was a symbol of a recognition of the fact that everything he had came from God. Yes, he was the shepherd. He raised the flock. But everything he did, everything he succeeded in, was given to him by God. And it could be suggested that to a certain degree, this is part of the reason for the mitzvah Bikurim. The mitzvah Bikurim is we take the first fruit and we put it down next to the altar. We bring it to Yerushalayim, put it down to the altar, and we say how everything I have, the land of Israel, the fruits, was all given to me by God. And it has to be gracious. It has to be the first of his crop. The crop that he treasures the most. The fruits of the tree, that's a tikkun for the sacrifice. That's a tikkun for the sacrifice of Cain. In other words, Cain got from the growth of the land, but he gave from the inferior because he saw himself as giving, not as a token representing the recognition of the fact that it is God who is giving it to him. So this is one approach to Korbanos. And the difference between Cain and Hevel and their understanding of Korbanos. And to a certain degree, the giving of Korbanos represents a certain challenge. And it's a challenge that the nations of the world didn't understand when they started giving sacrifices. Their idea of giving sacrifices was that they were feeding their God. They were giving food to their God. And to a certain degree, one has to be careful with the Korbanos we give to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Do we have the approach of Cain, even if we give the best of what we have, or the approach of Hevel? Are we giving to God? Or is it recognizing that God is giving to us and that everything we have really belongs to God? But there is another approach, and that is that the Alshich says, I heard this approach first from my father. My father told me that he heard this approach in the name of the Sfas Emes. Many years ago, I went through the Sfas Emes in Chumash, and I did not see this approach mentioned there. So I went to my father and I asked my father, where did he see it? And he said he did not see it in any sefer, but when he was a young boy in Warsaw was full of Gerach Sidim. So they had mentioned this approach to him in the name of the Sfas Emes. The Sfas Emes was the second Gera Rebbe. First one was his grandfather, the Chedusha Harim. And the Sfas Emes says, what's the difference between the sacrifice of Cain and the sacrifice of Hevel? And the Sfas Emes says that Cain, he gave his korban, he brought his sacrifice. But the Torah, when it talks about Hevel, Abel, bringing his sacrifice, the Torah says, the Hevel Hevi Gam Hu Meitchora Sono. That Hevel also brought, the words Hevel Hevi Gam Hu, he could be interpreted to mean he also brought a sacrifice from his flock, from his sheep. or we could understand it. Hevel hevi gamhu me'bchoros sono. From the best of his sheep, he brought also himself. In other words, Hevel, the sacrifice, was a symbol of giving himself over to God, or recognizing himself as belonging to God. And I think and the Balatanya in the Likutei Torah at the beginning of Chumash Vayikra suggests a similar explanation. It says, "Vayikra el Moshe v'yadaber Hashem elav me'ol moed le'mor daber b'nei Yisrael v'amarta aleim, and you shall tell them, Adam ki yaakov mikem korban la'Hashem." So the simple explanation: when a man among you bring an offering to Hashem from animals, from the cattle or from the flock, shall you bring your offering. But the pasuk could be, certainly from a Hasidic perspective, and there were some words in the I remember when seeing in the Zohar that could be interpreted that way. That says, Adam ki yaakov mikem, when you give a korban from yourself, when you give from yourself a korban to God, in other words, the korban has to be from yourself. So, min ha-behema, min ha-baka, min etzon, takribas korbanchem. You give it from the animals. In other words, the animals that you're offering come together with the korban of oneself. With the korban of oneself. And I think we could suggest, we could somehow accept the explanation of the Rambam regarding Korbanos with this idea. And the Torah tells us that Noah, as I mentioned, after he gave the sacrifice, in other words, it could be in the time of Adam. In the time of Noah, sacrifices were on a very high level because they could not be perceived. They could not be perceived as feeding God. Because when man talks, when man understands, the major form of Korbanos is the animal sacrifice. Of course, there were menachos also. But the major form of Korbanos is animal sacrifices. And the challenge of Korbanos is, especially when the Odei Avodah Zarah are involved, also give sacrifices. There could be a perception, and I have to mention again, and it has to be mentioned again and again, what Rabbi Yehuda Chassid said. Rabbi Yehuda Chassid said, Minhag HaYehudim, the custom of Jews, Afilu hatov shebehem, even among the best of them, Keminhag HaGoyim asher b'sochem hen yoshvim. And we see it in our lives also, that our philosophy, our attitudes, are influenced by the nations in whom we dwell. And that's on an individual level. On a national level, we have to be on guard, not to be influenced by the trends of the thinking of the nations, where that thinking is diametrically opposed to the philosophy of the Torah. So, the Korbanos, giving Korbanos represents a certain challenge, because person could
We lost him again. Hold on, everyone, please.
Okay. All right. So the Korbanos. Because of this, up till the time of Noah, up till the time man became allowed to eat meat, we could suggest that Korbanos was considered to be a higher form of worship of God. But then, when man was allowed to eat meat, Korbanos became a lower form of worship, because it could sometimes give the impression that Chas v'Shalom, that just like the old day Avodah Zarah, those who worship idolatry were feeding their God, that it was an act of giving to God, of feeding God. So there is no question from Adam, from Cain, from Hevel, no question from Noah. But the question is from the Avos. Now, my uncle, not, at least in the notes that I read, he wasn't responding to the Rambam's question. It could be that it's because of the Rambam that motivated him to come to this. He said it's true that it's mentioned that Avram built 3 altars, 3 mizbechos in Parshas Lech Lecha before the Akedah. Matter of fact, there are those in the time of the Gaonim who suggested, it has to be understood why, who suggested that the 3 matzahs on Pesach correspond with the 3 mizbechos, the 3 altars that Avram built. We know that Pesach is the holiday of Avram. Shavuos is the holiday of Yitzchak. And Sukkot is the holiday of Yaakov. Avram is Yetzias Mitzrayim, is the Exodus. He's Goy Mikarav Goy. He separated himself. Avram Ivri, he was at the other end. The whole world is at one end, and he was separate from the whole world, although he was very much involved in the world. And Avram, the three sacrifices, the three matzahs correspond with Avram is the one who feeds the malachim matzah, who goes to Chazal tell us it's matzah, and but the question is, so Avram, my uncle suggested, until the Akedah, never gave a carbon, never gave a sacrifice. What did he do? He built mizbechos. He built altars. He built altars, 3 altars. But he did not put any carbon, any sacrifice on it. And the question is, So what was the purpose? What was the purpose of that korban? What was the purpose of that sacrifice? And the answer is that the purpose of the sacrifice was the purpose of the sacrifice. In other words, on the contrary, he wanted to show he could not give animal sacrifices anymore, because the giving of animal sacrifices became identified with the idea of giving to God, me giving to God, not God giving to me. And it became identified, chas v'shalom, with the idea of feeding God. So Avram built the altar and brought himself to the altar to show that he was the sacrifice. He wasn't a sacrifice in the sense of having himself killed, chas v'shalom, but he was a sacrifice in the sense of giving himself over, dedicating his life to God, and recognizing everything that God gave him, and everything that he had, including himself. It was Avram Hevihu. He brought himself to God. And the word korban comes from the word karev, coming close to God. He brought himself to God. So he built an altar to show that the true sacrifice is the giving of oneself to God. And so this, I think, is, so the early korbanos that were given by the Avos, the patriarchs, on the contrary, there was nothing put on the altar. It was just Avram. It was just Avram giving, symbolic of the fact that Avram was giving himself over to God. But then a change took place. And the change was the Akedah. Now, what happened in the Akedah? In the Akedah, Abraham was told that he should take his son Yitzchak and put him on the altar as an olah. An olah is a korban that is completely given over completely to God. Many korbanos, shlamim, other korbanos. You partake, the Kohen partakes, and part is put on the altar. But the olah is burned completely on the altar. So Avram was told to take Yitzchak and to put him on the altar as an olah, as a korban olah to God. And the Torah tells us how Avram took Yitzchak and bound his hands. It went 3 days till they reached Har Moriah, Eretz HaMoriah, and he bind the hands of Yitzchak and its feet, and he was ready. He took the knife, and all of a sudden a malach came out of heaven, and the malach said, "Al tishlach yadcha lanav, al tasla muma." Don't do anything. And this was a test. And then Avram sees a ram from afar, and he puts the ram in place of Yitzchak. And from that point onward, Korbanos has a new perspective. The Korbanos is in place of man. The ram is in place of Yitzchak. very interesting. Rosh Hashanah, which was the day that the Akedah took place, that has this basic idea that the animals in place of us, Slichus has to be at least 4 days, except we have to start from the Sunday. 4 days before Rosh Hashanah. Why? Because a sacrifice has to be examined 4 days before it's put on the altar. So, in a sense, the idea behind Rosh Hashanah is that we are the sacrifice. We are giving ourselves over to God. So we have to check to make sure. And matter of fact, I think Das Kennedy, the Parshas on the Shulchan Aruch says, "Va'asisem," in regard to the carbon of Rosh Hashanah, "Va'asisem, you shall make," and they interpret, "You shall make yourselves the carbon." Rosh Hashanah is dedicated to the idea that we are the carbon. Yes, there are animal sacrifices, but they're only symbolic. We are the carbon, and this is the day. Rosh Hashanah is the day dedicated that commemorates the Akedah. The Akedah was to give us the perspective that the animal sacrifice is in place of us. Avram first had to build altars and, in a sense, not put any animals on it, to rid ourselves from this perspective that we're giving it to God, that we're feeding God. Have to have the attitude that everything belongs to God, but more than that, that we belong to God, that we symbolically are giving ourselves over to God. And then, after that approach, in a certain sense, was achieved, then Abraham had to come to the point to understand that we could give animal sacrifices, and perhaps because there was a need, and there would be a need in the future to give animal sacrifices. As the Rambam says, but it has to become with the idea of giving oneself over to God. Now, it's very interesting. The Torah tells us, the Medrash tells us, that after the Akedah, Abraham said, before the Akedah, I didn't ask any questions, because when there is a decree, there is a decree. You know, one of the questions asked is, how is it that Abraham pleads on behalf of the people of Sdom, but when it came to the sacrificing of Yitzchak, he didn't plead? He got up early in the morning. Vayashkem Abraham baboker. And the answer is, by Sdom, there was no command given to him. It was just revelation. But when a command is given, a person could try to understand, but a person has to submit. And so Abraham said afterwards, he asked HaKadosh Baruch Hu, what was the idea? On one hand, you tell me, Ki Yitzchak Yikal Chazara. From Yitzchak will be your descendants. On the other hand, you say, Halei Sham Lola. Take him and put him there on the altar as an Ola sacrifice. And then you say, Al Tishlach Yadcha Lanar. Do not do anything to him. How do we reconcile And HaKadosh Baruch Hu said to Abraham, Lo amarti lecha shakteyu ela halehu. I didn't tell you to slaughter Yitzchak. I told you to raise Yitzchak on the altar. That is the purpose of Korban. The purpose of Korban is to raise ourselves. We don't have to go on the altar, but the giving of the Korban, the idea is that we are giving ourselves over to God. The Korban is just the symbol of giving ourselves over to God. And I think
We lost him again. Hold on a minute, everyone.
Korbanos is halehu. We give the Korban to understand the idea of giving ourselves over. But it's for us to give ourselves over to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Halehu, to raise ourselves spiritually. And it's very interesting that in the Yashir, we say, Zekeli Vanveyu, this is my God. And Pargamunkel says Vanveyu means, and I will build for him a mikdash, a noveh. A noveh is like a residence, a hut. Zekeli, this is my God, and I will build for him a mikdash. Elokei Avi, the God of my ancestors, Varomemenu, and I will exalt him. And the Pargamunkel says Varomemenu means I will serve him. How is service manifest itself? Service manifests itself in acting like the Avos, in following the custom of the Avos. Abraham is the example. Abraham, he puts Yitzchak on the altar, but then an animal is placed in place of Yitzchak. And the idea is ha'alehu. The idea is the ultimate goal is raising oneself, and one raises oneself by giving himself over to God, by coming close to God. And that's the word korban, the sacrifice. Now, it's interesting, in Chumash Parshas, the Torah tells us, Vayivra Elokim es ha'adam b'tzalmo, God created man in his image. B'tzelem Elokim baroso, in the image of God he was created. My father would always ask, so it seems redundant to Pasuk. On one hand, the Torah says, God created man in his image. And then the Torah says, in the image of God, he was created. How are we to understand that? Why did the Torah have to repeat itself immediately? My father said, by Yivra Elokim es Adam b'tzalmo, God created man in his image, means with a small h. Each person was created in their own image. A person, it was a Hasidic Rabbi who would say, if God will ask me, why wasn't I like Rabbi Akiva? I would say, because I wasn't Rabbi Akiva. When God will ask, why wasn't I like the Rambam? I'll say because I wasn't the Rambam. When they'll ask me, why wasn't I like the Baal Shem Tov? He was a Hasidic Rebbe, so I'll say because I wasn't the Baal Shem Tov. But God will ask me, why weren't you like you should be? Then I'll have nothing to answer. I'm not going to be held responsible for not being other people. But I will be held responsible for being myself. Each person is a different person. By Yivra Elokim Es Adam B'Tzalmo, each person is different. No two people are alike. And different things are expected for different people. In religious circles, there's a tendency to try to imitate. But that's not what God wants from us. God wants us to give ourselves over, not to imitate somebody else. So the korban that the Nesi'im, that the princes gave, if the korban, the sacrifice, was just the external sacrifice, they all gave the same sacrifice. They all gave the same sacrifice. There would be no reason for the Torah to repeat the ingredients of the sacrifice 12 times. But if each one included himself in the sacrifice, if the sacrifice was symbolic of the fact that he's giving himself over, and each person is different, and each person has a different mission from God, when they're put into this world. And that's why perhaps on Rosh Hashanah, it's the first of the Aseret Shemei Tshuva. And what we do Tshuva, we're not doing Tshuva wide warrantly like so-and-so. We are doing Tshuva because we're trying to fix our own mission. So when the Nesi'im gave their sacrifice, each of them gave themselves over with their sacrifice. And each one was different. So the Torah wrote their sacrifices over as if they were completely different sacrifices. So this is the answer as to why was it different sacrifice. But the idea behind the Rambam, in other words, the Rambam considered avoda, sacrifice, as a lower form of service because a person could easily be misled in understanding what sacrifices is. So a person has to be on special guard to remember that the idea behind sacrifice is the hevel hevi gamhu. He has to bring himself together with his sacrifice. And this is what our whole, in a sense, our whole service to HaKadosh Baruch Hu has to be hevi gamhu. It's not just things that we do. We have to give ourselves over to HaKadosh Baruch Hu in everything that we do. Sacrifice represents everything that we have, everything who we are. And in a sense, of course, a person doesn't have to give all his money to charity, whatever it is. A person uses money for himself, but he has to dedicate himself to HaKadosh Baruch Hu as well. And that which he uses for himself, if he dedicates himself to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, would be considered in the service of God as well. Okay, we'll leave it here. All right. Any questions? Nancy?
Oh, sorry. So one question is, we are commanded to not imitate the Goyim, so how come we're allowed to give sacrifices? What's the difference between it?
Okay, we lost him again. I'm sorry. So won't be able to have questions today. Thank you all for putting up with our technical difficulties. Have a good week. And the God willing, we'll see you next week, and we'll be able to resolve our technical difficulties by then. Okay?